US President Joe Biden has marked the first anniversary of the storming of the US Capitol when a violent mob of Trump supporters attempted to stop the certification of the 2020 election result and Biden's win. In his speech, the president sought to lay out the truth of what happened that day. A year on, many Trump supporters continue to spread false narratives about the attack, and many Republican lawmakers refuse to acknowledge that President Biden won the election. He said that American democracy is under threat as long as this discord remains. He also had a very frank assessment of his predecessor, who he said set the stage for the attack by continuously sowing doubt about the 2020 election.
He's not just a former president. He's a defeated former president. Defeated by a margin of over 7 million of your votes.
Let's bring in DW's Washington Bureau Chief, Ines Pohl, and reporter William Glucroft, both of whom were with me here in the studio as the events of a year ago unfolded. Let's start with you, Ines. So we had President Biden speaking to the nation. What stood out for you?
Well, Phil, that was really a historic speech and probably the strongest so far from President Biden. It is really very rare to hear such harsh and personal criticism from a sitting president about a former president. I mean, he talked about his bruised ego, so and other things. So he was really very outspoken, and he kind of changed his strategy. As for now, we knew him as a president who really tried to reach out to the other side, to unify the country. But with this speech, he made it crystal clear. He has given up hope to convince Trump supporters that he is the elected president. He has given up hope to convince, as you just referred to, the Republican lawmakers who stand firm behind the big lie that the election was rigged. So this was kind of really a clear attack on all Trump supporters.
William Glucroft, let's pick up that point about the attack. President Biden never named Donald Trump. But he went after him time and time again.
President Biden never named Donald Trump, and Steven Spielberg never showed Jaws, the shark, and what made it one of the most terrifying movies of all time. And Joe Biden runs that risk of enlarging this boogeyman that's out there by constantly referring to him. It's this man behind the curtain. And there's a real risk there. He's walking a very fine line. You can't ignore the elephant in the room, no pun intended, since Republicans, their icon, their mascot's the elephant. But when you address it, you make him more powerful, more strong. Remember, Donald Trump is banned from social media. He's very quiet. We can't hear him right now. And so how to address him, how to talk about him, is a really risky move for Joe Biden. He's the president. Joe Biden runs the risk of bringing himself down to the level of Donald Trump, who he himself says is a defeated president. And we'll have to see the days and weeks go on as we head towards the midterms in November, how the Democrats are going to play this, because Donald Trump is very influential, is very powerful, can't ignore that, but also don't want to give him even more power and give him even more influence.
Right. Ines Pohl in Washington, lots of Republicans didn't attend this event. It happened just over an hour ago. Is that too soon for us to assess what sort of reaction there has been?
No, it's not. We hear criticism from both sides, predictable criticism from the Republican side and from those Trump supporters who pay attention. And to be quite frank here, that's not many, because it is really hard to reach them anyhow. And even a speech from a sitting president doesn't get a lot of attention from that side of the political party. party sides, so to speak. But Phil, what I find interesting, there's also criticism from the Democratic world, because they say, as kind of William mentioned here, that he really not only took a risk, but took it too far, because this was not a speech which was meant to unify. This was a speech which is polarizing, and so this is really, as I said earlier, a change of his strategy. So it will not go only down well. He will definitely get a lot of applause from Democrats, but the fear is that with that speech, he kind of really put himself in even deeper risk to lose the midterm election this November.
Understood. Ines and William, stay with us. What we'll do now is we will have a further look at the events of the 6th of January a year ago today.
Long before Election Day, Donald Trump had announced that if he should lose the White House, then only because the election was rigged. It didn't come as a surprise that thousands of Trump followers gathered in Washington, D.C. the very day the peaceful transition of power was meant to take place, January 6 in 2021. I had been at the mall for hours to report for DW News and could physically feel how the mood changed during the speech of Donald Trump. The protests so far had been intense, but with every sentence Donald Trump spoke, it got more and more aggressive.
Our country has had enough. We will not take it anymore, and that's what this is all about.
No one was prepared for what happened then, neither police nor politicians. The images of Trump supporters storming the capital of the United States shocked the world and left deep marks in this country, which claims to be one of the oldest democracies. The findings of the investigations showed how close a real coup d'etat was this cold January afternoon.
Well, Ines, Pohl, your report there. Let's talk about the people who did the storming, because the idea that the election was stolen is still widely held there.
Absolutely, and it seems to be impossible to convince those people from the truth. But as President Biden himself said in his speech, this is probably the election or the result which was kind of checked the most in the whole history of the country. It was counted over and over again. It took days before the official outcome was announced, because they wanted to be crystal clear that the election is legal. But that doesn't matter for those Trump supporters who just believe that he was re-elected. And why is that, Phil? Because Donald Trump has prepared that moment. It's not enough to just think about January 6 as a singular issue. Donald Trump has prepared that even before the election took place, that if he would lose, then only because the election would be stolen from him. So he really, really prepared this moment, and his followers still do believe that.
And William Glucroft, Donald Trump still the preeminent figure in the Republican Party.
Absolutely, and all the more as we've seen the Republican Party it has become the party of Trump, right? Any dissenting view has been swept away, ostracized, criticized, and we see lining up for the midterms in November, mini-Trumps, so-called mini-Trumps, these little candidates running for districts all around the country, getting backed by Donald Trump, using a lot of his tactics, and Republicans who have opposed Donald Trump getting challenged within their own party by other candidates. Now, we should be clear, Donald Trump has not made any intentions known about his thoughts for 2024. But 2022, Donald Trump is still, in a way, on the ballot, at least his ideology or his approach to politics. And as I said earlier, Democrats are going to have a real big challenge on how to confront that, because when you confront it, you make it bigger, but when you ignore it, you will give it space to metastasize. And that is a huge political problem right now in the U.S., especially in a country where you only have two options, a 0 or a 1, a black or a white. And there's really very little in between.
OK, so I'm going to put the same question to both of you. Joe Biden, in his speech, said that democracy was attacked on that day and the Constitution faced the gravest of attacks. So we'll start with you, William. How would you assess the state of US democracy now?
Basically, what we've seen is a kind of extremism, a kind of white nationalism that has always existed in America on the fringes, and also not completely on the fringes. If you look to the Civil Rights Movement, if you look to the Jim Crow era, if you look to after the Civil War, when black people were lynched in the streets, and the Ku Klux Klan had an extreme amount of power in certain parts of America. But you've seen these kinds of forces now come to the forefront, to the very halls of American power, to be legitimized and to not be called out. We saw this, for example, in the Unite the Right rally in 2017, when there was a far-right rally, and Donald Trump said there's good people on both sides. That's what we're seeing now. Nothing new, but certainly more extreme.
All right. And same question to you, Ines. How would you assess the state of US democracy as we start the new year?
As I don't want to repeat what William said, because I totally agree on him, I want to kind of talk a little bit about another aspect. So the concern for many is that the January 6th insurrection has set a precedent for any disputed or close election in the future. Many are talking about the impact to the 2024 presidential election, but I think we really have to wonder whether the 2022 midterm election and the institutions that kind of hold the democratic process together will hold firm, especially with expectations that candidates running for offices will simply not accept the outcome and possible putting another dent in US democracy. So that is something we really have to put some thinking in, I think.
Thank you for that, Ines Pohl in Washington. William Glucroft here with me in the studio. Thank you both. Well, let's get some German political reaction to that speech from Thomas Silberhorn. He's a member of Germany's opposition Christian Social Union and he's their parliamentary spokesperson on transatlantic relations. Welcome to DW. Do those events of a year ago in Washington have any relevance for us here in Germany?
Yes, of course. We followed very closely this domestic debate in the United States. Also because we had an attempted attack on the German Bundestag in August 2020, so half a year earlier, at the margins of protests against COVID-19 restrictions whipped up by right-wing extremists. So we also experienced an attack on our parliament. And that's why these attacks at the hearts of our democracies are attacks on our democracies itself. And that's why this is not only a US debate domestically, but an international debate, and the stability of our democracies is at stake.
And what went through your mind when you saw that rioting unfolding on Capitol Hill a year ago?
It was unbelievable because there were red lines exceeded by so many citizens. And there is no self-empowerment in democracy. That's why we have to assure ourselves on the core values of our democracy, as it laid down in the German anthem. This is unity, law, and freedom. And there is a certain minimum consensus of Democrats needed, that there is no self-empowerment permitted, but public institutions need to increase their credibility again. We're shrinking credibility of political actors, of journalists. We have at the same time a growing skepticism and a growing division of our societies. We are threatened by attacks from outside our democracies, but also from inside our societies. And that's why we have to be very aware of these threats. We have to address them publicly in public discussions. We have to increase the transparency and the dialogue as close to our citizens as possible. But in substance, we have to strengthen our core values, unity, law, and freedom.
So in a world riven by a pandemic and the rise of the far right and people protesting against having their liberties clamped down on, albeit in a good name, are you quite happy that what happened in the United States, in Washington, can't happen here in Germany, especially given what happened in August of 2020, as you mentioned?
I fully trust in the professional work of our and your police, public prosecutors and courts, and of course the parliaments. We have to lead this discussion publicly. At the same time, we have to make concrete offers to our citizens. Democracy is when you get the government you deserve, because it's your decision. So we all are part of our democratic order, and we have to make very clear distinctions to autocratic orders who do not offer freedom of speech to their citizens, who do not offer the freedoms we deserve in our liberal orders. And that's why we have to be very clear and distinct and be aware of the achievements of our liberal orders.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thomas Silberhorn from Germany's Christian Social Union.
Thank you.
Well, federal prosecutors say that as many as 2,500 people may have been involved in the January 6th attack. The legal and political consequences are far from over, with a congressional investigation underway, plus law enforcement pursuing cases across the country. Democrats are under pressure to conclude their work before November's midterm elections, after which they may lose control of Congress. Let's bring in DW's William Glucroft, who has more on this. Tell us more, William.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, this is one of the largest and most complex investigations in American history. And let's have a quick look why that is. So there are two tracks here. First, there is the legal, the criminal side of things. And so far, we're looking at 725 people arrested in connection with the Capitol attack. Now, some of them have military and law enforcement experience or belong to militias or other far-right groups. But many more are first-time offenders who say they simply got caught up in the chaos of the day. Now, around 165 guilty pleas have already come in, and 70 of them have been sentenced. Many more will go on trial starting next month. And then there are 350 more suspects that federal agents are looking for. They're still at large. Now, not all the defendants were directly present or actually breached the Capitol, and that is making for a very difficult prosecution and a lot of disagreement about how hard to go on those involved. It's also unclear if these investigations will extend to big-name media or political figures for any of their potential involvement. Where might that come in? Well, that's the political side of things. Now, you might remember, Republicans rejected a broader, more formal investigation, so Democrats, who control the House, that's the lower house of the legislature, they established their own special committee to investigate the causes and consequences of the attack. Now, there's a 9-person panel that includes just 2 Republicans, and that shows just how few Republicans are willing to publicly cross Donald Trump. This committee has gone through a huge amount of evidence, including 300 witness statements, 30,000 records, 52 subpoenas. A subpoena legally requires a person to answer questions, and if they refuse, they can be held in contempt of Congress, which has so far happened to 2 people, both of them close Trump advisors. Others are suing the committee to keep it from getting access to documents. And the question is, how much will this committee go after high-level Trump allies or even Donald Trump himself? And what will they do with any evidence they collect? And if Democrats lose the House in November, this committee is likely to get shut down. But the biggest question is, does any of it matter? The committee says it wants to have high-level hearings in prime time to present its case to the public. But the House already did that when they impeached Donald Trump for the second time, this time last year, in connection to this insurrection, and the Senate acquitted him. It didn't change public opinion much then, and that appears to still be the case. Depending on the poll or the question asked, a considerable number of Americans, and sometimes majorities of Republicans, believe the lie that the election was stolen, despite no evidence and all the evidence to the contrary. Many fear for American democracy or expect another mob-like attack. Republican-led states have tightened voting rights, and Trump has never been stronger in his party. Most of those convicted for their involvement in the attack are getting light sentences like house arrest, fines, or probation, with just a few people facing some jail time. And that's because the U.S. doesn't know this kind of political turmoil. So coming up with the appropriate punishment that fits the crime is a big challenge. Judges disagree about sentencing. Many of the individual alleged crimes are small time, Sarah, but they add up to the most serious attack on American democracy since the Civil War.